So I'm joined by my first guest here on my channel. Welcome, Poppy.
Hi, it's really good, really nice to be here.
Well, thanks for saying yes.
No worries.
So you're a reenactor,
Yeah,
a tour guide, a
yes.
photographer, a graphic designer, a Jeep owner, and a cat mum.
Yeah, I'm a woman of many talents.
So I see. So how did you get into history?
So I had a portion of my childhood growing up on the old First World War battlefields on the Somme. I was very lucky that my parents moved out to France in the 90s, and then when I came along, we stayed here for a few years. And when you're surrounded by this much history, you really can't escape it. Both of my parents are also historians as well. So again, you really can't escape that when you've got books everywhere and artifacts and whatnot. So, and I think it kind of went from being an interest to, as I got older and certainly as I was a teenager, going, I quite like the idea of sort of turning this into maybe a career or, continuing into it throughout adulthood.
So did you go to school in France?
No, I didn't. I was homeschooled for a couple of years and then we moved back to the UK and I had primary and secondary school in the UK.
Oh, okay. Just wondering what the French education would have been like for history.
It's not bad. It's getting better. There's a definite big interest in the First and the Second World War. Certainly as we sort of progress beyond major sort of landmark years. So
Mm.
we've not long had the 80th anniversary of D-Day and the Second World War. And now we're into the 110s for the First World War, and I'm seeing professionally more French groups coming out and exploring the battlefields. So yeah, it's really good to see.
Good. I remember we were at a campsite in Arromanches once, and the campsite owner was just talking to her, and she gets French people go, and
Mm,
because it's Arromanches, it's on top of the hill, it's overlooking like the Mulberry Harbour
yeah,
and all of that, and she regularly got French people staying, and they were like, "What's that out at sea?" It's like, "Oh, it's the Mulberry Harbour. Why else would you be here?" So, "Oh, we're here for the beach and the seaside." It's like,
yeah.
okay.
I think that's it's. I think because Normandy was a pleasure beach before the Second World War, especially for sort of rich Parisians, it was it's Paris plage, and it was. I think that attitude hasn't changed enormously, so it's nice to see it still being used as a
Mm.
pleasure beach. But a lot of tourists turn up and are very confused as to what everything is. But I think the education of that is certainly getting better with the younger generations, and it's being taught more now, which is much better. So it is improving.
Good. Glad to hear it. I'm not sure what the state of the British education is in these days. I don't remember doing much about the World Wars. I have to say we did about bit around like Remembrance Day, but I think we did more
Mm.
World War history in English rather than history, if I remember right. I
Well,
mean, it was a while
in the
ago now, but
current national curriculum in the UK, it's compulsory to do the First and Second World War, looking at
okay.
20th century warfare as well. So a lot of the groups that I guide on the battlefields are school groups, so they're sort of GCSE plus groups. Um, Again, because that's their core one of their core topics is looking at either the effects of the First World War or medicine throughout warfare, or looking at Hitler's rise to power and the effect of the Second World War. So
That's probably why I missed it then, because I didn't do history GCSE, so that's probably why I missed it.
I did the Cold War for my history GCSE. So
Okay. So, like I said before, you're a reenactor.
yes.
From what I've seen, reenacting in continental Europe is
Hmm.
very different from the reenacting over here. It just looks on a
Yeah.
very different level. Don't get me wrong, there are some amazing groups here in England that do some
Oh,
amazing
absolutely.
displays
Yeah.
and put in a serious amount of effort. It just looks next level over in the mainland.
I think it's something that I look in or I look at a lot, and it's you can very much tell the difference between um those of us who live in continental Europe and who grew up listening to the stories of their families under the occupation and then gaining that interest versus the UK, which of course, apart from the Channel Islands, was not occupied.
Mm.
And I think that's how the attitude changes greatly. I mean, again, don't get me wrong, in all over Europe, you still get some truly appalling reenactors, but I think that's anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
And I think the benefit we also have is we can go back to these original locations and set up in these original places. So one of the reenactment events I try and do every year is it's a hospital setup in Normandy, and we are incredibly lucky that the owner of the chateau lets us come and display every year in the original chateau that this unit was set up in the first place. So I think there's a lot of that. It's the memory thing as well as the we're in the actual place this is happening thing. So
Yeah, I've seen some videos from, I think one was like an open top train, so it was just like the bottom half of the train and like German vehicles and
yeah,
soldiers on this train. The train was moving. Health and safety would have a fit if we
yeah,
even suggested doing that here in England.
yeah,
And another one was a big parade, either last year or the year before, and everybody was in step. They looked absolutely immaculate. Everybody looked the business. It just looked incredible.
yeah. I think again it's the whole sort of looking at commemoration versus liberation versus
Mm.
celebration. So for a lot of us in Europe, we celebrate the liberation, we celebrate D-Day because it's the time period when Nazism was at its downfall. So for us, it's very much a huzzah, the war is ending. Whereas in the UK, I think it's still incredibly solemn. And a lot of people use that to then go, oh, reenactment shouldn't happen because it's a very dark time in our history. But then you could argue the same anywhere. So
Yeah, I've seen a few comments from Brits when they go over to any commemorations that,
yeah,
why is it called a celebration? It's like, why is there parties and music? It's like, well, they were occupied, so it's a totally different experience to them
yeah,
than it is to us going over,
it's
potentially.
celebrating our freedom, and it's no different to how the Americans view the 4th of July, essentially.
Mm.
So you know, we were celebrating freedom from tyranny. So I can understand the partying and the music and the dance events and things like that. I go to dance events when I'm in Normandy. We're all dressed in uniform, and it's a fantastic experience. And it sometimes does literally feel like stepping back 80 odd years. But I know people have their problems with these things, and I wholeheartedly understand. So,
Mm. So you mentioned your Normandy display. I was going to ask you about that. Can you talk us
mm.
through what you display in Normandy?
So there's a group of us we come from all over Europe. Most of our group are Dutch and Belgian. Myself and my partner were the only Brits in the group. So we feel a little bit outnumbered, but it's quite nice. And we reenact the 326 Airborne Medical Company's first hospital set up in Normandy. So we're looking at essentially it's the glider-borne element of the 101st. And they arrived in Normandy. The first contingent, who were paratroopers, arrived with the rest of the paratroopers in the early hours of the 6th. And their objective was to make their way to a tiny little village called Cheville, to set up essentially what became the first Allied surgical hospital in occupied Europe. So in itself, it's incredibly important because it's this first major breakthrough of medical treatment in occupied France. And as part of that, we are very lucky, like I said, we get set up in the original chateau grounds where the hospital was in 1944. And there's a whole group of us that come together. We bring original equipment, we bring vehicles, uniforms, and we have this great immersive display. So if you come onto the site and you walk through the beautifully reconstructed gatehouse, the first thing you'll see is a whole series of medical tents, and each tent has a theme. So we have one which is administration and headquarters. We have one that is triage. We have dentistry, supplies, things like that. and then you walk into the barns and you'll have our fully immersive surgical suite where we do surgical demonstrations for members of the public. And I think it's one of the best reenactments I've ever done. It's absolutely fantastic. The level of dedication and research that goes into it. You know, we study period medical textbooks. We look through army medical guides. We try and find all the correct equipment, procedures of the day. So it's a really fascinating hands-on way of teaching the public about how these medical services work. And it's the part of the 101st. I mean, I know lots of people are like, oh, the 101st is so severely overrepresented, but it's the section of the 101st that is the most underrepresented to me, certainly. So it's really nice to be able to do something a little bit different.
Yep, and I've seen the pictures and videos of it. So if anybody is in Normandy over the commemorations, I would highly recommend going to that display. I haven't made it yet, but I will one year.
We could always do with more war correspondence.
Yes.
You would be surprised the amount of war correspondents that turn up to our event and like, oh, we want to come and film you guys because it looks really cool. And I'm like, yes,
okay,
absolutely.
Nice. What's the views on German reenactors over on mainland Europe? I imagine it's probably very different to an extent as it is over here.
So we have to be not careful, but more respectful of these things. And again, it's the whole occupied versus not occupied territory thing. So the event that we do, we sometimes have German POWs as casualties for our demonstrations, our triage and whatnot. And there are German groups that set up in Normandy to look at the German aspect of the D-Day landings. And a lot of it is very educational. And it is just about treading carefully and trying not to upset people, because of course there are still people alive that remember the occupation as children, as teenagers. But I personally can't recall there being any problems in recent years with German reenactors in our section of Normandy. Admittedly, I stay in one very confined area, which is around sort of Saint-Merry, Saint-Marie de Montièville, so we don't tend to go out from that area. But again, you will get some people that really do take the piss per se and try and do things they shouldn't do. But I think it's worse in the UK, a lot worse.
Yeah. One German camp we sort of stumbled across in Normandy was actually behind closed doors. So it was in the grounds of a museum. So you had to physically pay to go into the museum to then go into the outdoor bit of the museum to go around the German camp.
Was that Krasville, what was it, Krasville, Krisbeck, or one of the batteries up in that area? They do a big German camp or they try to do a big camp every year.
Yeah, it wasn't that one. It was Omaha Museum.
Yeah, I know which one. Yeah. And again, I think it's the whole, they don't want to openly display the fact they have German soldiers, but it is for me as a historian, and I'm very much a modernist historian, and it's important that certainly to look at both sides of the picture, both sides of the barbed wire. Okay, Nazism is absolutely terrible. It's atrocious, and we need to learn from it. So I think it is important to have both aspects, but it has to be done properly. It can't be done half-assed. It can't be, it can't be the kind of thing that ends up on, say, Farfest because it's just weird or atrocious or whatever. So it's definitely important to have both.
I agree. There has been a few incidents, shall we say, here in England involving German reenactors. A lot of events now either don't have Germans and just do sort of allied and home front events. Some will have Germans, but not certain units.
Yeah.
And then others are just, everybody's welcome as long as you behave yourself.
Yeah.
And do as you're told. And as soon as you don't do as you're told, you're out the gate and you're not coming back. I
just remember War and Peace, gosh, this must be about 9 years ago now. They were filming a documentary there. The documentary ended up being look how weird reenactors are. So that's a story of itself. But the guy who was doing it was from New Zealand, and we were having dinner one night, and these two Dutch guys dressed in SS uniforms walk over to where we're having dinner, and the guy jumps up and goes to interview them, and he's like, "Oh, look at you two! You're dressed as you're dressed as SS officers. Why do you do it?" And he was like, "What would happen if you dressed like this back at home?" And they said, "Oh, if we return to the Netherlands wearing this uniform, we'll probably get lynched in the street." And it's like, but then you feel it's acceptable to come to the UK and do it. It's just, it's that sticks in my mind because it's appalling, frankly. And that's that's not what we want looking at German reenactment. We want, the educational side of things, not that, I want to be a Nazi. And it gets ridiculous.
Yeah, I enjoy going to look at the German displays because
absolutely,
over here we don't see much German kit, like even in the museums. No. So in the museums, if there's German stuff, it's generally either like trophies and souvenirs that soldiers have captured and brought home, or it's like crashed aircraft from like the Battle of Britain and stuff. So the only way we're going to see like full German kit is at a reenactment, or if you go on holiday to like Normandy, go to their museums and everything as well.
Exactly. I mean, again, I agree. In the UK, there's often very little about the Germans, admittedly, because of course the only Germans that ended up in the UK were prisoners or casualties or whatever. But I mean, as a child, I spent lots of my family holidays in places like Normandy or the Ardennes or whatever, looking at the First and Second World War. And the first few years that the D-Day Experience Museum had been opened, when it was just the little house on the corner, almost the entirety of it was looking at the occupation of Normandy and how the German troops live day to day. And I mean, the display in the house really hasn't changed much since it opened 20 odd years ago. But it was fascinating walking into a museum, and the first thing you see is how were the Germans reacting to the Allied invasion. And you have scenes of a German first aid post set up. You have headquarters section set up in one of the other rooms, looking at how to deal with troop movements and things. And that for me was the fascinating bit, looking at how things literally were on the other side of the barbed wire. And again, I still think it's very important.
Yes, I agree completely. We mentioned you were a graphic designer. So for those that don't know, Poppy, you reproduce medical things, bits and pieces for reenactors and
so I focus on medical equipment for the British and the Americans in both the First and Second World War. Most of what I do is American Second World War because it's far more popular than most other sort of reenactment niches. And then my partner, he does like the pocket fillers and the kind of the things that people would carry with them. So we're looking at paperwork, stationery, ID cards, things like that. So again, it's a really nice niche, and it's something we both really enjoy doing because it's for me, again, it's more of the research aspect of it I find interesting, and then you get to sort of sit and create these elaborate designs for hours.
So without giving away all your little secrets and the tricks of the trade, what's the process of finding something you want to reproduce to then having the final product to sell to your customers?
So usually it starts off with me probably scrolling through eBay going, oh, that looks nice. Or I go to a military fair and I pick something up and I go, yeah, that looks good. Oh, that would make a nice repro. And usually if it's something I physically have, it's scanning everything, photographing everything. If there's like little ornate details on it, it's scanning all those into high resolution. And then all of that gets uploaded. I primarily use Photoshop and Illustrator. So all of that gets uploaded. And then from that point, it's literally sitting there with the original, the scan, and then Photoshop open, recreating every single bit from scratch. So I don't scan things and clean it up. I make everything from scratch digitally. After which I do like a test print, usually just on paper, just to make sure that everything's lined up correctly. If it's a box, for example, it will actually close up properly, and I've not sort of over measured a bit of it. At which point it's then deciding what kind of material. I mean, if you look behind me, there's all my materials. Lots of different types of paper and card. At which point it's print it on cardstock, whatever it needs to be printed on. And then usually that's kind of how you get a finished product. So
Is the time frame for each product a bit different? So
yeah,
if
it
it, there's
really
like
depends.
the smaller it is, obviously the quicker you'll
Small,
probably get it
yeah.
done.
So if it's something that's really like graphic heavy, so I sat and I recreated the Barbasol boxes from scratch. So I have an original, and I scanned it in, and I think I must have spent about 4 or 5 hours on Photoshop lining up all the segments, all the graphics, redoing all the text, making sure that because there's always like weird little printing errors. I was like even trying to match those printing errors to make it look more authentic. But of course, everything gets printed and it looks brand new, which is obviously the point. You
Mm.
want it to look brand new. But if it's something really simple, like I don't know, a bandage box, it's usually 4 sides of text, and that's about it. So it really depends. It can be anywhere from like half an hour to several hours, or even several days worth of work, depending on how complex it is. So
Mm. You mentioned all your card and your paper and everything. Was it trial and error getting the right sort of card? Because
yeah,
obviously paper and cards very different to what it is back then to now.
it's finding modern equivalents to what would have been available at the time. So it's things like finding typewriter paper or copy paper, which is very, very thin, very fragile. So some of the stuff I reproduce, it's on slightly thicker materials just because the originals to me are so fragile. And
Mm.
I don't want to produce something that if you take it out of the envelope, it's just going to tear
Just
the
gonna,
second you try
yeah.
and use it. But in terms of things like the cardstock, I mean, I've been doing this for 9 years now, and it's 9 years of buying, sampling, testing, printing, trialing different printers as well.
Mm.
Everything I print is on inkjet because to me it looks a little bit more authentic. You get sort of the ink bleed you would get with certain items. And it's literally trial and error with everything, and then eventually settling on, oh yes, this cardstock works, only for the supplier to turn around and go, we don't make it anymore. So it's a constant kind of circle of buying and testing new materials to improve stuff because I'm constantly updating files, updating materials, changing things to make them look more authentic. So it's a never ending circle of doom, I suppose.
And the link to Poppy's shop and her other half shop will be in the link in the description below. So if you want to go check out what they reproduce, by all means. I've had stuff off them before and it is
I think I did
top-notch
an
stuff.
ID card for you, didn't I? For a
You did,
Warpay one.
yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do like doing those ID cards. They're all done on a 1941 Royal typewriter, so it's a genuine
Yeah.
wartime typewriter. So
Very nice. Very nice. So you do tour guiding as well.
yeah,
Is so you tour guide First World War predominantly.
yeah.
This is going to sound really odd and bad talking about wars, but bear with me. Is there one you prefer? So obviously you reenact and reproduce stuff for World War Two, and
Hmm.
you tour guide for the First World War, and obviously you
Yeah.
grew up around First World War stuff. Is there one you prefer to do, or do you just love them both the same and it's
My
a break
my
from
heart
each
lies
other?
my heart lies in the Second World War. I can't lie. I don't get me wrong. I find the First World War utterly fascinating. Um, and I've spent, nearly a decade guiding, researching, educating on the First World War. It's me. It's still utterly fascinating, but I don't know why I just have this bigger draw to the Second World War, and I think partly because of what I do for work, partly because of the reenactment as well. And there's part of me that goes move to Normandy, but that's the whole other thing. Um, but I think a lot of it is how far away we are now from different conflicts.
Mm.
So with the First World War, of course, we have no living memory left of that. I was very lucky as a small child. I got to meet veterans of the First World War and spend time with them. And again, with the Second World War, as a sort of a young teenager, I got to spend time with veterans from York, who would come out to Normandy every single year. One of whom is still alive, the fantastic Ken Cook, who at 101 is remarkable for his age. And a man I hold very dearly in my heart. So, you know, and I think a lot of it, yeah, it's a living memory thing, but it's also availability of information as well. So, but I love both equally from a historical point of view, but I think I would always draw more towards the Second World War. There's also more to
You
study.
had your yes, you had your first TV appearance a few weeks ago.
Yes, I did. That was nerve-wracking, to say the least.
You want to talk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, so on the internet, on Facebook specifically, I run a couple of First World War like history research groups. And we had a post pop up one day of someone going, "Oh, hello, I'm a BBC producer, and we're looking for people to talk about the Battle of the Somme." And I was like, interesting. So I contacted the lady, and I was like, "Oh, hello, you know," which I hadn't seen it though. BBC were doing a documentary, so it's really interesting for me because I try and keep up with sort of documentaries and everything and whatever's happening next. And I was like, "Oh, it's really interesting. Can you kind of talk me through it a bit more?" And she's like, "Yeah, so this is kind of like the synopsis of what we're doing. We're wanting to look at sort of more the Irish and the working class backgrounds of those that fought on the Battle of the Somme." And I was like, "Oh, that's interesting. You know, often it's a very sort of linear view of the First World War. So it's interesting to see what they were wanting to do." And they were like, "Oh, it's BBC World Service, so we're being funded by several different aspects of BBC, but it's going to be going out on BBC One about a week before the anniversary of the battle." And I was like, "Okay, that's fine." And then she was like, "Oh, I see from your Facebook that you are a tour guide and a historian living on the Somme." And I was like, "Yeah." And she was like, "Can I possibly like give you a call back in a couple of days?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, fine, no problem." And I said, "You know, the people on our groups have got some really fascinating stories, so I'm sure you'll find something that's kind of what you're looking for in respect to the working class or the Irish element." So I had several sort of video calls with her and the directors and the other producers, and they were like, "So," I just remember the first one that they sat down and like, "So do you actually live on a battlefield?" I was like, "Yeah, I do. I live on a tiny little village called Courcelette, the Canadian battlefield of the First World War." Like, "Oh, okay. And so how close are you to the Somme?" And I'm actually on the Somme. It's, you know, it's a border village. And they were like, "Oh, okay. And how far away are you from the Teatval Memorial?" And I said, "Well, if I look out my bathroom window, I can see it." So, and they were like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah." And they were like, "Oh, you really weren't kidding when you said you lived on a battlefield." And I was like, "Nope." No, all around me, literally. So they were interested in that, and they were like, "Oh, we'd really like to bring you on. We're going to be out doing a couple of days of filming for this new documentary, so we'd love for you to come and join us for a day and basically walk our presenters through some of the key sites." So we ended up going to the Lochnagar crater. Then we looked around Albert as well, just to get an idea of what Somme was like. They visited a couple of cemeteries. We went to the Newfoundland Park, and they were utterly fascinated by it. And we actually did a lot. I think we spent probably 7 or so hours filming, doing various bits and pieces, looking at different things. And they were like, beforehand, they were like, "Oh, do you have any relatives that fought on the Somme? Is this why you live here?" And I said, "Well, the only relative I know of is my great uncle Dan. He was working class lad from Essex. He'd grown up in a slum in Colchester." And they were like, "Tell us more." I was like, "Okay." So I sort of went through his history, and I said, "You know, he's quite a remarkable man. You know, he joined up pre-war. He was one of the first contingent over in 1914. Their battalion were fighting all throughout 1914 before being moved and evacuated on. he was then in Gallipoli. He then came back to France. He was on the Somme. He fought at Cambrai. And they were like, wow, this is such a fact. And I said, yeah, because he's an old contemporary. He was in France in 1914. And he was wounded probably 4 or 5 times, including on the first day of the Somme. And I'm like, oh, that's really fascinating. But do you know where he was? And I was like, oh, he was in what is now the Newfoundland Park. He was one of the British regiments, who were one of the first over before the Newfoundlanders went over on the 1st of July. They're like, oh, that's really fascinating. And they said, bring a photo of him if you've got one. So I said, yeah, I've got photos of him. So I brought one with me. And we were standing in Newfoundland Park, sort of close to where he was wounded. And I was like, yeah, so we're in this area. Where we're standing now is vaguely where, you know, the 1st Battalion of the Essex were on the morning of the 1st of July. They were some of the first to go over the top, including my Uncle Dan. And we were filming at this point. They're like, oh, tell us the story. And I was like, oh, well, he was ordered to go over the top at St. John's Trench. And as he went over, he got shot in the chest. They were like, what? I said, yeah. And luckily, there was somebody, whether he was just it was a friend or a stretcher bearer, someone saw he'd been wounded, grabbed him by his pack, pulled him back into the trench. And if it wasn't for that guy, he wouldn't have survived. So I said, yeah, it's quite a remarkable story. And they were just like, this is fascinating. You know, in fact, you live here, you know where he was wounded. And they were like, oh, and did he survive the war? And I said, yeah, he died. He was 80 something when he died. So he lived quite a good long life afterwards. So that was really interesting. And it was then discussing. So the presenter, Jordan, is from Northern Ireland. And of course, if you grow up in Northern Ireland, you hear a lot about the First World War and specifically about the Battle of the Somme. So it was really interesting talking to him about what he grew up with and the stories of people like Billy McFadden, VC winner, Quigg, another VC winner. And of course, Ireland still greatly commemorates the First World War every year. You know, as a battlefield guide and historian, I see a lot of Irish groups coming out to the Somme to commemorate men from their towns, their villages, their cities. So it was really interesting getting sort of both perspectives of it. And then one of the things they wanted to look at is they had just come back from the Ukraine, and they were looking at what happened in Pripyat with the nuclear disaster, but they'd also looked at fighting in Ukraine. And he was like, you know, how does the trench warfare in Ukraine compare to trench warfare of the First World War? So again, that was kind of the other tie into it, was looking at how old conflicts still influence modern conflict. So it was a really fascinating day to spend with them. And as my first kind of like big girl TV work, I'd done a few bits beforehand for various other documentaries, but it was interesting being brought on as a contributor and as a historian. So
that's an amazing story, and it's a small world. How you can just
it is a small world.
Find a TV presenter on Facebook.
Yeah.
As you do.
Yes, you do. The internet is a very weird place.
How do you find being a female in the World War world? If
difficult sometimes. I think these days there are so many amazingly empowering female historians that we are not quite beyond the sexism in history thing. It still happens frequently, sadly. But you know, if it weren't for sort of generations of women before me, I mean, one of the women I look up to most, or two of them in fact, is Lynn MacDonald, who interviewed so many Great War veterans and wrote some fantastic books. And then Rose Coombs as well, who was a fantastic historian and researcher who worked for the Imperial War Museum after the Second World War and up until the 90s. You know, she was still writing, she was still researching. And I think thanks to women like them, you know, we're very lucky that today in the 21st century, it's a lot more accepting to have female historians that aren't looking at female issues. So, admittedly, a lot of the research I do personally is looking at women in conflict. But then I also, as a First World War historian, most of what I look at is trench warfare, which is not very womanly. And myself, other female historians, we still get problems with people going, "Oh, you're a woman. What do you know about war?" And it's just like, well, it happens. It's very frustrating when it does happen. It is still a problem, especially when you're looking at very niche subjects and people say to you, "Oh, you're only." I think the other problem is because I'm young still. I'm 20. How old am I? 28. And they could look at me and go, "You're such a young thing. What do you know about warfare? How can you know all these things?" And it's like one of the topics I debate greatly is the myth of, as something I'm writing about at the moment, is the myth of Hitler placing an SS guard at Vimy Ridge in the Second World War. And I have spent a lot of time looking through German documentation, looking at eyewitness accounts, looking at all sorts of different. Oh, I love your cat.
She's been fast asleep all morning and now appeared to come for a love.
But it's looking at that and looking through all the contemporary evidence, and that there is none that says Hitler ever had an SS guard at Vimy. It's utter BS. But I try and explain this from a very methodical point of view, going, look, we're very lucky we have all this documentation. We even have documents from the German government with criteria for monuments that were to be destroyed. We have documents about so many orders that were written about. The archives are full of these amazing documents. But I try and sort of give actual evidence, and they're like, "Oh, you're a woman. What do you know?" And it's like, well, immediately, to me, you don't care. So fine, whatever. So, it happens, sadly, and it happens more often than it should still, but it's slowly getting better.
Yes, I agree. It's better than it was, but we're not quite there yet, are we? It's like
more
women.
of a problem in the reenactment world than it is in the day-to-day historian world for me, because there have been countless times where, again, my research in reenactment is almost purely women and medical services. Okay, very feminine thing to research. But obviously, I look at the men's side of things as well, because one of my subjects is looking at 326 Airborne Medical Company and just generally how the US medical services operated in Europe. And not too long ago, someone posted on Facebook asking for feedback on their reenactment impression. And it was all right. It needed a lot of constructive criticism and feedback to improve it. So I said, "Oh, you've got off to a good start, and it's nice to see that you're doing a unit that's very underrepresented. Would you like me to share some feedback with you? And then these are things you can sort of slowly work to improve on, upgrade your kit, blah, 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 whatever." And they're like, yeah, message me. So we started chatting. And I was like, "Oh, so this is the unit you're portraying. This is, what you're currently wearing is more suitable for a different period of the war. So you're looking more sort of Bastogne, but if you want to do Normandy, this is kind of more what you need." And then he was like, "Oh, my wife is doing this as well. I have a big problems with wives and girlfriends being dragged to reenactments that they're when they don't want to be there." So I was like, "Okay, like, is she doing this voluntarily, or is she being this against her will?" And he was like, "Oh, no, she wants to come and do it with me." So she was dressed in some questionable uniform that was certainly not at all suitable for what she wanted to do. So again, giving feedback, going, "This is what you need to look at to improve, but just bear in mind the unit you're portraying, there were no nurses, they didn't have any until the end of the Battle of Normandy, so she can either do something else like civilian, or you represent that very end stage of what they were doing in Normandy." And they're like, yeah, okay. At which point he then comes back and starts arguing against every bit of advice I've just given him, and I'm just like, okay, we're having one of these moments. So I was like, okay, I understand. It's jumping into doing reenactment. It can be expensive, it can be tricky, whatever. But we're very lucky in the 21st century. We have the internet and photographs and books, fantastic books on all these things. And I was like, okay, well, I understand your wife wants to do a combat nurse impression. Okay. And I was like, well, here's some things you could do instead. Here's a list of ideas. And I said, for your kit, this is what needs improving if you want it to be up to a decent level for, most reenactors, especially if you want to look to join the 101st Airborne group. And I remember he then forwarded, I think, a text from somebody else. I think it must have been in a group with him, going, oh, Poppy doesn't know anything about the 101st Airborne. All she knows about is whack nurses. At which point I wanted to scream into a void. I was like, oh. And I said, well, I replied and said, it's a little bit insulting considering I work the leader of my reenactment group is the leading authority on this specific medical detachment of the 101st Airborne. And he was like, well, how does, I mean, fine, whatever, but how does that qualify you to give us answers? And I was just like, okay. And then he blocked me. So I was like, fine, whatever.
Fine.
Cool. Don't take any of my advice. It's fine. But that happens a lot where people go, oh, what do you know about the Airborne? You're a woman. And it's like, oh, well, you'd be surprised. I used to have it a lot the early days when my partner and I, the first couple of years we were together, and we were doing events in the UK, and I had a very basic hospital sort of display. I mean, we were very limited with space, so we had to sort of condense a lot of what we were doing, and it was usually very simple. So looking at the kind of equipment they had, triage, things like that. And I remember one of the first events we did one year, we were at, I think it was Gunpowder Mills, and this family walk over to my partner and look at him and start asking him 100 questions about the medical display. He's still doing airborne. He's a gunner at this point, so he's not even doing medical at this point. So he's walking around with a BAR, and he's just like, "Why are you asking me? My partner, she's my girlfriend. She's standing there. She's the one that knows everything about medical services." At which point they looked at me, looked really confused, and went, "Oh, we assumed because you were standing here that you were the one that knew everything, and that she was just your girlfriend." I was like, "Oh, thank you." But again, that happens a lot, and it happens in Normandy as well. My partner, he's great. He's learned so much from what we do in Normandy, and he's read some of the books that I've bought and stuff that I've researched, and talking to our group leaders as well. He's absorbed so much information. He finds it almost as fascinating as I do. But there's still points where someone asks him a question and he honestly says, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not that knowledgeable on it, but if you ask my partner, she'll be able to tell you. And when he says she, they're always like what? Like, yeah, her, that one. The historian, not me. I'm not the historian. It's just, it can be a little bit insulting sometimes, but it is what it is.
I get it a bit with vehicles, so I really like old vehicles and stuff. So I've got my Jeep, and I was a mechanic before I got into history and stuff. So it's like women can like tanks and trucks too.
Yeah, tell me about it. I adore my Jeep. I love her to bits. And again, it's the whole, we'll be somewhere with the Jeep, and they'll start talking straight to my husband, and they'll ignore me. And it's just like, I'm still here too, I'm in uniform. You can talk to me. I know as much about her as he does. And it's But again, it happens more on social media. So I'm usually on the post about the Jeep. So if we take us somewhere or if we do something or whatever, and the amount of ridiculous comments. I've had someone accuse me of abusing my Jeep before because we got it muddy.
Oh.
They were like, woman, what are you doing driving this vehicle? And it's just like, thank you.
Is that not what it's there for?
I don't know. I've met some people who keep their Jeeps in a climate-controlled garage for 9 months of the year. I know.
Painful, isn't it?
You might as well just call it glorified museum piece at that point.
Yeah, there's no point spending that much money and that much time on a vehicle if you're not going to use it.
No. People are always shocked when we drive around and she's dusty or she's muddy or it's raining, and they're like, "You drive it in weather?" Yes.
Yes, it's survived the last 80 years and the World War.
So I
It
mean,
will
you know,
survive a bit of dust and mud.
she lived in Australia for 40 years. I think she'll cope in the northern French climate somehow. So, you know.
So, what's your favourite war movie or TV show?
Oh God. Um, Recently I've renewed my appreciation for the Pacific, because it's very hard hitting, and I think
Mm.
it's frankly, it's probably going to anger some people. I think it's better than Band of Brothers in a lot of
Oh,
aspects. I have a lot of beef with Band of Brothers, but that's just me as a historian. Don't get me wrong, the series is fantastic. I still love Band of Brothers, but there's a lot of inaccuracies and lack of research and things that just. Masters of the Air is definitely, again, I think it's a fantastic series, both from
yeah.
the sort of historical point of view and the effects, kind of, amazing sort of hard hitting stories. Looking at that,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Ridiculously, one of my favourite war films, I think if you can call it a war film, is The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp. And I love it. It's a fantastic film. And it spans the First and the Second World War. And it's a lovely story, and it's very
Mm-hmm.
sad, but it's very sweet. That's a tricky one. I like too many films. I think that's my
Too many
problem.
films.
Too many films.
Favourite book? Like World
Um,
War book?
so I like reading a lot of memoirs. There are two books that come to mind. One of which is "And If I Perish," which is looking at the Army Nurse Corps throughout the whole of the Second World War, and it's written by a historian of the Army Nurse Corps, Evelyn Monaghan, and she interviewed and collated a lot of testimonies from women who served in the ANC in the Second World War, and she brought it together in this really well written sort of history. Essentially, it turned into almost an unofficial history of the ANC. And again, some of the stories that she writes about are just, it's hard hitting and makes you realize like how much, can I swear, is that a problem,
Yep, go for it.
how much shit these women went through, and how badly looked upon they were by certain people. There's one instance where one of the evacuation hospitals who set up on Anzio beach, on the Anzio beachhead, and they are constantly being shelled by the Germans, by the Italians, whatever. And nurses are dying. Nurses shouldn't be
Mm.
dying. That's not, they shouldn't be in areas where they should be dying. And Italy for the ANC it was appalling for them. The conditions, the risk to life, to health, and the risk of death was just absolutely insane. And I think she writes about it so well that there are points that when I reread that book, I'm sitting there in tears going, ah. Another one of my favorites is Michel Beautre's book, Part 2, Carentan, which is the whole
Mm.
bit that he does about Kiev. So you can see why it's a favorite. And again, he has found some fantastic photographs and testimonies of the men of the 326. So I think, yeah, those two definitely some of my favorites.
And what are you reading at the moment?
I'm just about to start another nursing. Um, it's an autobiography this time. Um, and I'm currently also reading the Pacific, trying to renew that interest. I know
Mhm.
very little about the war in the Pacific, and I want to know more. So
Mm.
it's sitting on my bedside table at the moment. My copy of the Pacific. I always have a couple of books on the go, usually First World War, Second World War as well. So another one of my favorites, The Caretakers, by a good friend of mine, Caitlin DeAngelis, and she's a professor. She wrote a fantastic book, again a really niche subject, of the Commonwealth War Grove staff who were living in occupied France and Belgium in the Second World War,
Okay.
and talking about their struggles, those who then joined the resistance networks and the chains of evacuation for downed Allied airmen. So again, really fantastic book if anyone ever wants something that's of a very different look at occupied France, 100% read it. And again, it'll make you both sad and angry at the same time because of just how terribly these people were treated. So
Perfect. That's all my questions I've got for you. Anything you want to mention or add or chat about?
I think I think we've covered quite a lot of good ground today, so I'm quite pleased. Don't disrespect women in warfare. My
Yeah.
biggest thing. Do research on the Unheard Corps because it's some of the most fascinating stories you'll find of women in warfare. If you go to any American cemeteries anywhere in the world, go and visit the women. They get very rarely visited. And don't be rude to female historians. There we
Yes.
go. That's my end
That's
point.
today's top tip. Don't be rude to female
There we go.
historians.
There we go.
Perfect. I will link all of Poppy's socials, shop, everything in the description below. So go show Poppy some love. And stay tuned for the next guest, whoever that might be and whenever that might be. If you're interested in having a chat, let me know. And I'll see you next time.